From Yahoo Finance, this is Electionomics. I'm Rick Newman.
And I'm Alexis Christoforous. The 2020 presidential race will be decided by voters in about a dozen competitive or so-called swing states, where Joe Biden and Donald Trump will focus their efforts to win the 270 electoral votes needed to reach the White House. Joining us to talk about this is Stephanie Miller, Managing Director of Fiscal Note Markets. Stephanie, good to have you here on the Electionomics podcast. So look, generally speaking, there are about 6 swing states or battleground states: Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Arizona. But you are adding a few more this year, including Ohio, Iowa, and Minnesota. Tell us why.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So the states that we all watch tend to be these Rust Belt middle states, and those are still on everyone's must-watch lists, including Ohio. A lot of folks know that Ohio is hard for Democrats to get, but I think a lot of folks are aware that Joe Biden is spending a tremendous amount of money there to try to win the state. But a place like Iowa is really interesting too, because historically these Midwestern states, and I'm from Nebraska, so I have a lot of love for the Midwest, but these Midwestern states are very red. It's very hard for a Democrat to win them. But in this case, Iowa has a very, very close Senate race. And so very interestingly, pollsters I've spoken to are thinking there's a viable scenario where the Senate race down ballot actually helps Biden and pulls him into a victory. So that's very unusual. Arizona is another state where that could happen, where a close Senate race could actually help determine who wins the White House. So it's very unusual dynamics in an already really unusual election cycle.
Steph, a lot of the analysis I've been looking at is really focusing on just 6 swing states, and you're taking a broader view, which is why I wanted you to come on and talk about your analysis. You've got it up to 10 or even 12, in some of the scenarios you look at. Why are you taking that broader view? Do you know something the rest of us don't?
So one of the questions I get all the time from investors is, why the heck should we be paying attention to any polls right now when they were so wrong in 2016? And there's been a lot of pollsters defending the polls since then, saying, well, in 2016, we actually got it right. The popular vote did give Clinton the win, but the Electoral College is what's trickier to predict. And so I'm obsessed with the Electoral College, as I think a lot of people are. And so it's true, I'm watching 10 states, and then you can add in 2 other districts, because Nebraska, where I'm from, again, I love all the Nebraska plugs I get to do. There's a district that has 1 electoral college vote that in a red state could actually go blue. And in Maine is the opposite. In Maine, there's 1 electoral college vote, the 2nd district of Maine, that could go red while the rest of the state goes blue. And so what I really wanted to understand is, based on the current trends of these swing states, not the popular vote, but how does the Electoral College play out? And when taking the variance in all these states into account, there's a lot of scenarios that have either tied elections between the 2 candidates, or Trump or Biden winning by just like 2 or 3 Electoral College votes. So that shows that I think every single one of these really, really matters, and is really important to try to get right.
So as you're doing this analysis, could you highlight what a couple of surprises might be? So for example, Florida could go either way. I don't think we'd be surprised either way in that state. You said Ohio now, it used to be a bellwether, but really it kind of leans Republican. But you've got a couple others on here that would be surprising if they played out the way you're kind of gaming it. What are a couple of those?
Yeah, and I will say, in a lot of my scenarios that I've looked at, I have Florida going red to Donald Trump, because it's not my understanding that Biden's campaign is investing as much money and time into Florida, because it is very difficult for Democrats to win Florida. And so instead, my understanding is that Democrats are really invested in these Rust Belt states, where Trump won these states for the most part. So I'm thinking Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, even, where there's a big manufacturing base that feels like a lot of these people feel like they've been forgotten. They feel like global trade has been at their expense, and that Trump really understands them. And a lot of the messages that Trump has espoused during his campaign in 2016, has pushed during his presidency for the last 3.5 years, have been to attract these voters. But interestingly, they're all very aligned with a lot of long-standing Democratic principles, such as protecting labor, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're very also gettable for Biden. So I'd say, one of the more surprising states that I could see going either way would probably be Wisconsin. And a lot of people are critical of the Clinton campaign for not focusing on Wisconsin. So I think Biden knows that he needs to spend a bunch of time there. Pennsylvania is another state that I can see going red or blue based off of recent polling that really shows it's tightening between the two candidates, where Trump was showing a much more significant lead at this same stage in the 2016 cycle. And then not a Rust Belt state, but Minnesota is one that, unless it's an anomaly, there's been a recent poll that shows that a double-digit Biden lead from earlier in the summer is now basically neck and neck between the two candidates. So something's going on in Minnesota that is making people more willing potentially to vote for Trump. I think that's super important to watch.
So Stephanie, clearly Trump will need to win some of the states that are currently leaning toward Biden to reach the electoral votes he needs to take a second term, but he can't afford to lose some of the states that he won in 2016 and still win the White House, right?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. I think he could lose there's a scenario where he loses Wisconsin, he loses Michigan, he loses Arizona, and he still wins. So he does not need to win all of them.
How does he win in that scenario?
So
he wins Florida, he wins North Carolina.
Yes, he wins Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, North Carolina, Iowa, Georgia, Texas, any of these fringe. So Texas is a state I'm watching. I think it's very unlikely to actually not go to Trump. But the polling has been getting tighter as the demographics of the state have shifted. So I think it's certainly worth watching how it plays out. But yeah, interestingly, these two very tiny districts where the states have the ability to split the entire electoral college vote, this Nebraska and Maine 2nd district, I think they are reliably going to cancel each other out. But, maybe it could come down to just one of those, and what is going on counting votes and for one electoral college vote. My, would that be crazy if that's what this election came down to.
How much does COVID-19 play a part in these battleground states? Iowa is now a recent hot spot for new infections, and who might that play out for, I guess, better for Biden or for Trump?
Yeah, so before all of this COVID stuff happened, it really looked like this was Trump's election to lose. The economy was up. The idea that voters, when they're faced with two choices, would not choose a person who's, for the most part made their lives better, didn't really make any sense to me. So it seemed like a very straightforward Trump win. So COVID is like the opposite, right? The person who is responsible for making your life worse, it's really, really hard to demonstrate value to voters that way, whereas Biden can just come in and say what he would do, but he doesn't have to prove anything. So just a much easier path for him. The exception here when it comes to COVID is on the economic side, that more voters tend to trust Trump than Biden on economic issues and economic recovery. So if when people are going to the ballot or casting a mail-in vote over the next few weeks, if the decision they're making is not about health and not about the past, but about economic growth in the future, that gives Trump a very good edge on the election on compelling voters to vote for him.
I want to go back to the upper Midwest. So I'm just kind of intrigued by what you're seeing in Minnesota. I looked up Larry Sabato's crystal ball at the University of Virginia. He has Minnesota leans Democratic. That doesn't seem surprising. I think of it as a fairly reliable Democratic state. But you're seeing that could change. So would you expect those three upper Midwestern states to vote the same? So Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So we know in 2016, Minnesota stayed blue barely. but Wisconsin and Michigan, Trump won both of those. Would you expect them to kind of show the same outcome this year?
That's a great question. It really, to me, depends on the campaign strategy. So in the event that the Biden campaign is putting equal resources into all three, and the Trump campaign is putting equal resources into all three, then it is very reasonable to expect they would move sort of similarly. These places are different, though. They have different, local business interests and different histories of voting. To your point about Minnesota, it's really interesting to me. Like, a sign that something is different now than it's been in the past is that at this same stage in the 2016 cycle, a really good polling showed Trump with only 31% of people saying they were likely to vote for him. And he lost the state, and so that makes sense. But right now, he's polling at 47% in really, really good polls. So clearly more people are liking what they've seen of him now than they did before. And whether that is his economic track record or whether it's just about the future and not maybe trusting Biden for on the economic grounds or something else, like, clearly there's something about Trump that's resonating with folks in these areas.
Well, I mean, these three states have also seen considerable turmoil during the last several months. George Floyd, that whole thing erupted in Minnesota, and that's where a lot of the violence happened. That began the BLM protest that then kind of swept the country. We just saw some problems in Kenosha, Wisconsin, where both Trump and Biden visited. And Michigan, I mean, I can't help but think of those armed militia members at the state capitol, shutting down the state capitol earlier this year. Is it possible that it's not the economy, but it's the law and order stuff that is top of mind for voters there?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think I recently saw a stat about the campaign ads that the Trump campaign was spending, what political themes they were spending it on, and criminal justice and law and order were among the top. So these are all very resonant. The Black Lives Matter movement has certainly changed the political dynamic. Another thing I would say that is really important for these groups of these types of states and how the congressional districts are divided around in the suburbs especially, is this whole back to school moment that we're in. So I have a toddler. It is super disruptive not to have schools open here in Washington, D.C. And I know that one of the ways that Republicans have been trying to resonate with voters is sounding way more sympathetic to the working parent than Democratic voters, who sound way more sympathetic to, taking precautionary efforts against spreading the virus. And your political view is going to dictate how you hear those things about 9 out of 10 times. But there is recent polling that not surprisingly, the predominant burden of homeschooling is falling on women over men. And white women are a group that Trump won in some of these places that he's at risk of not being able to win again based off of trends in 2018. And so doing things that are helpful to women, particularly white women and suburban women, can be really actually impactful in changing dynamics at the state electoral college level.
I want to shine the light on Arizona for a minute because, it's one of the fastest changing states probably on the electoral map. It's gone from being a Republican stronghold to a true battleground state. How did that happen, Steph?
I mean, definitely movement out of more liberal states into Arizona. So like Californians going to Arizona, Californians going to Texas. That's a big part of why we start seeing some of these changes happening in these states. And it's interesting, like one of the biggest differences between, I think, a Biden or a Trump win is who gets Arizona. I think it's very gettable for both of them for the reasons we talked about. The Senate has been a really big place where this has played out, in part because of the legacy by Senator John McCain, who was a Republican, but a very, very moderate Republican. That brand of and breed of moderate thinking tends to be something that seems to really resonate with Arizonans. And so you don't get very extreme candidates on either side. And it just seems like there's just been enough of a demographic shift that the moderate Democrats tend to be more likable a lot of the times.
Steph, you mentioned earlier that you kind of think Trump has an edge in Florida, and maybe the Biden campaign realizes that, and they are putting their resources elsewhere. What else have you noticed in terms of what the campaigns are actually doing based on what obviously is their own swing state analysis? For example, there were some reports that Trump's campaign stopped advertising in Michigan for a while for some reason. Maybe they were just running short of money, but you wonder, like, they never really come out and quite tell you exactly what's going on. You have to kind of guess. But is there any chance, for example, the Trump campaign is writing off Michigan?
That would be amazing. I'm not convinced of that yet. Certainly, Wisconsin is lower hanging fruit. There are other, Ohio, Pennsylvania. It's probably constrained resources more than anything, and really needing to efficiently spend. And yeah, I mean, if internal polling, for whatever reason, tends to be better. I actually don't know why. I've tried to understand why.
I mean, polling that the campaigns do themselves?
That the campaigns do, that the candidates do themselves. Yeah, so stuff that we would never see. And internal polling is a lot of what dictates how they spend their money, because it will help them try to get a better picture beyond what we see in these public polls around where things are more either at risk or safe. And, if there is internal polling that shows that Florida really isn't as strongly Republican, for example, it might make sense to divert money down there because there's so many votes associated with Florida. So that could be another reason why you would see some shifting of money around.
I was looking at some of your research, and I came across an interesting chart. The number of registered voters who say they will turn out specifically to vote for President Trump versus those who say they will turn out specifically to vote against President Trump are basically even. What do you make of that?
Isn't that wild? I mean, this president incites such enthusiasm on both ends of the spectrum. To me, that is the clear sign that it's really a coin flip. All this, a lot of the coverage that says this is that Biden's really ahead, that he's got a strong lead, to me misses the turnout issue, because a lot of people will say they'll vote for Biden, but they won't show up if they're not enthusiastic, or they'll say they'll vote for Trump and the same. And Trump's enthusiasm base is really solid. I think that's undisputed. And Biden's is rather weak in terms of the people who are saying they're enthusiastically showing up for Biden. There's not very many. And so having people show up for Biden because they hate Trump is actually a very helpful thing for him. And having that number then for Trump being offset on both sides of the enthusiasm gap means that everything in the middle is really gettable. And another thing that I've been looking at too on the next slide of that research that you were looking at is how many people voted for Trump in 2016 because he's not Hillary Clinton, and how many people voted for Hillary Clinton because she's not Donald Trump. Those numbers also canceled each other out. It was about 30% of people in both cases said that they were voting for the candidate that they did because they hated the other person so much. And right now, the hatred of Biden is really, doesn't even pale in comparison. The hatred of Trump is almost 3x what the hatred of Biden is. And so which side of that is going to be stronger? Probably not. Being really enthusiastic for or against is going to get generally the same number of people to show up. But we need to keep seeing then Biden's campaign really playing on this "I'm not Donald Trump" message, which we saw them do really well at the Democratic debates. And can they really maintain that when there's real issues that people really need to are asking Biden for answers on? Like, what I need to see from him if he's going to win is a message hammering home how he's not Trump. And then conversely from Trump, what I need to see from him if he's going to win is a message about how I'm going to fix the economy and I'm great, and try to get people to show up for him on the positive enthusiasm side. So that's how I think about it.
The huge question in all of this is, what can either candidate do to move the needle during the 6 or 7 weeks we have left, which gets to the travel that they're doing. I mean, obviously neither candidate is doing traditional campaign style events. Does it still matter that the candidates show up in the swing states, even if basically they just give a speech at the airport or someplace nearby? Like, does that matter?
I have no idea. I mean, my gut tells me no, right? Like none of it makes any sense. However, there's also recent fundraising data out that in the swing districts or swing states where Biden has gone and held virtual events, that he's made a ton of money. And so it's, there's two reasons to do that type of political event. One is the fundraising side, and one is the getting people to vote for you side. And in a lot of these swing districts, they're not uber wealthy, so you don't go to them to raise a ton of money. You go to them to generate a bunch of votes. And so the money game sounds like it's working well, but this voter interaction thing seems really hard for me to understand. And the people who are prone to Biden, for example, are not prone to want to be out in public right now. So even if he did show up, no one would probably show up to engage with him. So double-edged.
What demographic is really critical to President Trump right now? I mean, you mentioned white women earlier in the discussion. Is that going to move? Is that going to be are they the swing demographic, so to speak?
That's who I'm watching for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot of reason why that demographic is credited with giving Trump the 2016 victory. And, when history looks back on this, I think that is going to be one of the main places where we see a make or break for one candidate or the other. I think there are other demographics that are in transition, such as Latino voters who are in younger generations going more towards Biden, older generations more towards Trump, but nothing like this demographic of suburban white women that maybe, to Rick, to your question earlier, that tends to move together. And so maybe we see a few states with these women, not these women, I am a woman, with women doing this type of decision making that really could impact the outcome.
So Steph, who do you think is going to win?
So right now I would tell you it'd be Trump. I don't think he's got a solid, strong, durable thing where it can't go to Biden and it can't switch. But right now it really, really seems like he's got just a slight edge over Biden, because the states where he seems safer are more solid, have more electoral college votes, and are more solidly harder for me to see going to Biden than the states right now that are going to Biden. I can more easily convince myself they could swing actually back to Trump. And also because of social desirability bias. So that's that when you call someone up and say, who are you going to vote for? And they tell you who they think you want them to say or who they should say, but not who they're actually thinking. And that was believed in 2016 to have minimized the support for Trump ahead of the election versus when people actually showed up in private and could vote and not feel like they needed to do anything other than be true to themselves. A way to get around that is to ask people who they think someone else is going to vote for. And so if you call them up ahead of time and say, who do you think your neighbor is going to vote for example, you can try to filter that out. And those types of questions show Trump ahead.
A slim margin?
Yeah, a few points. And again, it just depends on and that's a national, right? That's a national number. And we know national numbers leave out a lot of nuance. Maybe think about that slightly tighter margin than what it's being conveyed as.
I think Biden's going to win. I think there's clearly an enthusiasm gap, but I think it understates the Democratic turnout. That's my thesis for today.
I love it. Well, let's bet a cup of coffee on this, Rick, and come back on.
Coffee? Bloody Mary at a minimum.
I love it. Well, here's the question then for all of us is when will we know who wins?
Yeah, exactly. That was going to be my follow-up question. This could be a very hotly contested election. So, and as we've established here, there are more battleground states perhaps than ever before. So a lot to be decided between now and November 3rd. Stephanie Miller, Managing Director of Fiscal Note Markets, thanks so much for being with us here on Electionomics. And be sure to rate and review what you just heard and saw. And you can follow me at Alexis TV News.
And me at Rick J. Newman.
Thanks, everybody. See you next time.